My name is Claire Donovan. For 14 years, I believed that keeping the peace was the same as protecting my family. I was wrong. If you've ever stood beside someone you loved while they chose silence instead of standing beside you, then you already understand the kind of loneliness I'm talking about. It isn't loud. It doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly, one small disappointment at a time, until one day you realize you've been carrying it for years. Before I tell you what happened, let me ask you something. What would you do if the last gift your mother ever made for you suddenly disappeared, and the person you trusted most looked you in the eye and said, "Just let it go"? At first, I thought I was only searching for a missing quilt. I had no idea that one simple search would uncover years of lies, hidden documents, and betrayals that reached far beyond anything I could have imagined. By the time the truth finally came out, I wasn't fighting for a family heirloom anymore. I was fighting for my children, for my home, and for the life I almost lost because I kept believing that staying quiet was the right thing to do. It all began on a warm Saturday afternoon in late September. The trees surrounding my father-in-law's farmhouse were beginning to turn shades of gold and crimson. The long gravel driveway was already filled with cars as relatives arrived carrying homemade dishes, folding chairs, and desserts for our annual family reunion. From the outside, everything looked warm and welcoming. It looked like the kind of family gathering people remember with a smile. I wish that had been the truth. As I parked the car, I glanced at my daughter Lily sitting in the back seat. She was 12 years old and smiling as she carefully held a small cedar chest on her lap. Inside that chest was the most precious thing I owned, my late mother's handmade quilt. My son Noah leaned toward the window, excited to see his cousins already running across the front yard. Their laughter filled the afternoon air. For a moment, I let myself believe this year would be different. Maybe everyone had grown older. Maybe old resentments had finally faded. Maybe, just this once, we could spend an afternoon together without anyone finding a reason to criticize me. I picked up the cedar chest and took a slow breath before walking toward the front porch. Behind me, Ethan locked the car and caught up with us. He smiled gently and squeezed my shoulder. Then he quietly repeated the sentence I had heard countless times over the years. "Just ignore them if they say anything. They don't mean it. They're still family." I smiled back, because arguing before we even walked inside never changed anything. Deep down, though, I already felt the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. Looking back now, I realized that my instincts were trying to warn me. Sometimes your heart notices danger long before your mind is willing to believe it. I only wish I had listened sooner. The front porch was already crowded with familiar faces. People hugged each other, laughed, and carried trays of food through the front door as if nothing in the world could disturb the afternoon. My father-in-law, Walter, greeted everyone with the same warm smile he always wore. He kissed Lily on the forehead. He shook Noah's hand. When he reached me, he offered a brief hug that felt more like a polite obligation than genuine affection. "I'm glad you made it," he said. "I wouldn't miss it," I replied. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then Ryan walked out from the kitchen carrying a glass of iced tea. He stopped the moment he noticed the cedar chest in my hands. His eyes lingered on it longer than they should have. "What's in there?" he asked. "My mother's quilt." His smile faded for just a fraction of a second. "You're still hanging on to that thing?" His words were casual, almost playful, but something about the way he said them made my stomach tighten. "It isn't just a quilt," I answered quietly. "It was the last thing my mother ever made."
Ryan shrugged as if I had mentioned an old towel instead of the most meaningful possession I owned. "It's just fabric." "You can't build your whole life around old memories." Several relatives laughed softly, not because the joke was funny, because no one wanted to disagree with Ryan. I looked toward Ethan. He had heard every word. He simply gave me that familiar look, the one that silently begged me not to respond. I lowered my eyes. I had become so used to swallowing my feelings that doing it almost felt automatic. Still, something inside me refused to relax. I couldn't explain why. Sometimes the smallest moments leave the deepest warnings. Lily gently touched the cedar chest. "Mom, can we show Grandma's quilt after lunch?" I smiled at her. "Of course." "Everyone should see how beautiful it is," she grinned. Grandma would like that. Hearing those words warmed my heart.
My mother had sewn every piece of that quilt by hand during the final years of her life. Some patches came from my childhood dresses. Others came from my father's old flannel shirts. There was even a square cut from the tiny blanket that wrapped Lily when she came home from the hospital. Each stitch carried a memory. Each color told part of our family's story. No amount of money could ever replace it. That was why I never let it out of my sight, or at least I thought I didn't. Before joining everyone outside, I carried the cedar chest upstairs to the guest bedroom. The room had always been used for coats, handbags, and anything people wanted to keep out of the way during family gatherings. I opened the closet, carefully placed the chest on the top shelf. Then I checked the brass latch one more time. Old habit. I gently rested my hand on the lid. "I'll be back soon," I whispered. The words escaped before I even realized I had spoken them. For just a second, I felt strangely uneasy, almost as if I were leaving something behind that I would never see again. I stood there, listening to the quiet room. Downstairs, laughter drifted through the open windows. Someone turned on old country music. Children shouted across the backyard. Everything sounded perfectly ordinary. Nothing warned me that before the sun went down, my entire life would begin to change. I closed the closet door, took one last glance around the room. Then I walked downstairs, believing my mother's quilt was exactly where I had left it. It would be the last time I ever believed that. Lunch began a little after 1 in the afternoon. The long tables in the backyard were covered with checkered cloths, serving bowls, and dishes that had been passed through Ethan's family for years. Walter sat at the head of the table. Ryan sat beside him, telling a story about a contractor who had tried to overcharge him for repairs at the farm. Everyone laughed at the right moments. I tried to laugh too. That was another habit I had developed over the years. I had learned how to appear comfortable even when every part of me wanted to leave. Lily sat beside me and whispered about the quilt. She wanted to show her cousins the blue square made from my mother's favorite Sunday dress. I promised we would bring it down after dessert. Across the table, Ryan looked at us. His expression changed the moment he heard the word quilt. It was subtle. A pause in his smile, a tightening around his eyes. Then he looked toward Walter. The two of them exchanged a glance so brief that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Almost. After lunch, the children ran toward the field behind the farmhouse. Some of the adults carried empty dishes into the kitchen. Others stayed outside with coffee and pie. I helped Ethan's aunt collect plates, while Lily followed close behind me. "Can we get the quilt now?" she asked. I smiled. "Yes. We'll bring it downstairs together." We walked through the kitchen and toward the staircase. As we passed the hallway, Ryan stepped in front of us. "Where are you two going?" "Upstairs," I said. "Lily wants to see the quilt." He leaned against the wall. There are a lot of people coming in and out of the house. "Maybe you should leave it packed away." The comment sounded reasonable. His tone did not. I looked at him carefully. "It's safe in the guest room." Ryan lifted one shoulder. "Your choice." Then he walked away. Lily and I climbed the stairs. The music from the backyard grew softer with every step. By the time we reached the second floor, the house felt almost empty. I opened the guest bedroom door. Nothing looked disturbed. Coats were piled across the bed. Handbags rested on the chair near the window. A child's sweater had fallen onto the carpet. I crossed the room and opened the closet. The cedar chest was still on the top shelf. For one relieved second, I felt foolish for worrying. Then I reached for it. The chest was lighter than it should have been. My hands went cold. I carried it to the bed and opened the brass latch. The lid rose without resistance. Inside, there was nothing. No quilt, no protective paper, not even the small lavender sachet I always kept beneath the fabric. The chest was completely empty. I stared at it, unable to understand what I was seeing. Lily leaned closer. "Mom, where is it?" I didn't answer. I searched the closet first. Then I looked beneath the bed. I moved coats, opened drawers, and checked behind the curtains. I knew the quilt was not there. Still, I kept searching. Sometimes the mind continues looking because the truth is too painful to accept. Lily's voice grew smaller. "Did someone move it?" "I don't know." My answer came out as a whisper. I checked the chest again. My fingers ran along the bare wooden bottom as if the quilt might somehow appear beneath my hand. It didn't. That was when I noticed the scratch near the latch. A thin silver mark cut across the old brass. It had not been there before. Someone had forced the lock. My heart began pounding so hard that I could hear it. I turned toward Lily. "Go find your father." She looked frightened. "Tell him to come upstairs right now." Lily hurried out of the room. I stayed beside the bed, gripping the edge of the empty chest. There were more than 40 people downstairs. Any one of them could have entered the room. But only a few people knew how much the quilt meant to me. And only one person had spent the entire afternoon making comments about it. Ethan arrived less than 2 minutes later. Lily followed behind him. "What happened?" he asked. I pointed to the chest. "The quilt is gone." He looked inside. Then he looked around the room. "Maybe someone moved it." "The lock was forced." I showed him the scratch. His face changed, not with shock, with discomfort. That difference mattered. "Ethan, who came upstairs?" "I don't know." "Did Ryan?" He exhaled slowly. "Claire, don't start accusing people. I asked you a question. I don't know where Ryan went." I looked at him. "You aren't surprised." "Of course I'm surprised." "No, you're nervous." He glanced toward Lily. "Can we not do this in front of her?" "Our daughter just watched me open an empty chest." "We are already doing this in front of her." Ethan rubbed his forehead. He always did that when he wanted a conversation to end. "Let's check downstairs before we make this into something bigger." "Someone broke into the chest." "I understand that." "No, you don't." My voice trembled. "That quilt was the last thing my mother made." "I know." "Then help me find it." He looked toward the hallway. For a moment, I thought he might finally stand beside me. Instead, he lowered his voice. "Please don't embarrass everyone." The words landed harder than I expected. My mother had been dead for 11 years. Her hands had touched every stitch of that quilt. Someone had taken it from a locked chest, and Ethan was worried about embarrassment? I closed the lid. Then I carried the empty chest downstairs. Conversation stopped as I entered the backyard. People turned toward me one by one. Walter stood near the dessert table. Ryan was beside him. The moment he saw the chest, his expression became perfectly still. I placed it on the nearest table. "My mother's quilt is missing." No one spoke. "I locked it in this chest less than 2 hours ago." "The latch has been forced." A few relatives looked at each other. Someone whispered near the porch. Walter stepped forward. "Claire, I'm sure there is a simple explanation." "I hope there is." I looked around the yard. "Did anyone move it?" Silence. Then Ryan gave a short laugh. It was quiet, but everyone heard it. "This is getting dramatic." I turned toward him. "Do you know where it is?" His smile disappeared. "Why would I know?" "You asked about it when I arrived. You talked about it at lunch. And you stopped me in the hallway when I went upstairs." Ryan crossed his arms. "So now asking questions makes me a thief?" "I didn't call you a thief." "You didn't have to." Ethan stepped between us.
Claire, enough. I looked at my husband. Enough? Let's handle this privately. Someone stole from me in this house. There are children here. There were children here when it was taken. Walter raised both hands. Everyone needs to calm down. His voice was calm and controlled, the kind of voice that had ended family arguments for decades. We will look through the house. If someone moved the quilt by mistake, they can return it. Nobody needs to feel accused. By mistake. The words echoed in my mind. No one accidentally forced a lock. No one accidentally removed a quilt and left the chest empty. Still, everyone began searching. Closets were open, cars were checked.
The laundry room, basement, and garage were searched. For nearly 30 minutes, relatives moved through the house pretending this was a misunderstanding. I watched Ryan the entire time. He never searched. He stood near the porch with his hands in his pockets, speaking quietly to Walter. Then I noticed something else. Mud on Ryan's shoes. The ground was dry near the house, but the path behind the old equipment barn was still wet from rain earlier that week. I looked toward the barn. It sat beyond the field, partly hidden by a row of oak trees. No one used it during reunions. At least, no one was supposed to. I started walking. Ethan followed me. "Where are you going?" "To the barn." "Why?" "Ryan has mud on his shoes." Ethan caught my arm. "Claire, stop." I pulled away. "Why are you trying so hard to stop me?" His face went pale. That was the moment I knew. Maybe Ethan had not taken the quilt, but he knew something. And whatever he knew was enough to make him afraid of what I might find. I walked across the backyard without looking back. The conversations behind me slowly faded into uneasy whispers. No one tried to stop me, except Ethan. He caught up just before I reached the gate leading toward the equipment barn. "Claire," his voice was almost pleading, "please don't do this." I stopped walking. For the first time that afternoon, I looked directly into his eyes. "Then tell me why." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That silence told me more than any explanation ever could. I turned away and continued toward the barn. The grass was damp beneath my shoes. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became. The laughter from the reunion disappeared behind me. Only the wind and the rustling leaves remained. The old equipment barn hadn't been used much since Walter retired from farming. Its faded red paint had peeled away over the years. One of the doors hung slightly crooked. A rusty chain wrapped around the handle, but it wasn't locked. As I stepped closer, I noticed fresh footprints in the mud. Not one pair, several. Most of them were recent. The edges were still sharp. Someone had been here today. I pushed the heavy door open. The hinges groaned loudly. Dust floated through the narrow beams of sunlight shining between the wooden boards. Old tractors sat beneath gray canvas covers. Broken tools lined the walls. The smell of old wood, oil, and damp earth filled the air. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed something near the back wall. A large green tarp had been folded over several cardboard boxes. One corner looked disturbed, almost as if someone had moved it in a hurry. I slowly walked toward it. Every step made my heart beat faster. I pulled back the tarp. Beneath it were several storage boxes. On top of the nearest box rested a folded piece of blue fabric. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that fabric. It was part of my mother's quilt. I reached out with trembling hands. It wasn't the quilt itself, only a loose square. One of the patches had been cut away. The edges were rough, freshly cut. Someone had taken scissors to it. For a few seconds I couldn't breathe. Why would anyone cut apart something so precious? Then I looked deeper into the boxes. Inside were old file folders, large envelopes, several metal cash boxes, and stacks of paperwork. One folder had fallen partly open. Across the tab, written in black marker, were 2 words: Donovan Property. I stared at the label. Our last name. My hands began to shake again. Slowly, I opened the folder. The first page was a copy of the deed to our home. I frowned. We had signed those papers years ago. Why would copies be hidden inside an abandoned barn? I turned the page, then another, and another. Something immediately felt wrong. There were signatures. Mine. Or at least, something that looked very much like mine. Except I had never signed these documents. Not once. The dates didn't make sense. Several forms had been filed while I was visiting my mother during her final weeks in hospice. I remembered those days clearly. I had barely left the hospital. There was no possible way I could have signed legal papers across town. A cold wave of fear swept through me. Someone had forged my signature. I kept reading. Property transfer authorization, power of attorney request, agricultural land agreement, temporary ownership assignment. Each page carried another version of my name. Each signature looked convincing. But none of them belonged to me. I heard footsteps outside, quick footsteps. Someone was coming. I instinctively closed the folder. A second later, Ryan appeared in the doorway. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. His eyes dropped to the folder in my hands, then to the blue patch of fabric lying beside it. Every trace of confidence disappeared from his face.
"You weren't supposed to come here," he said quietly. His voice no longer sounded amused. It sounded frightened. I stood perfectly still. "Where is my mother's quilt?" Ryan didn't answer. I asked again, "Where is it?" He looked toward the open doorway as if hoping someone else would arrive first. Instead, we were completely alone. Finally, he spoke. "It isn't here." "What did you do with it?" "I didn't." He stopped himself. That single hesitation confirmed everything. "You know exactly where it is." Ryan swallowed hard. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." Those words echoed inside my head. Not supposed to happen. Not an apology, not a denial, an admission that something had gone terribly wrong. I held up the property documents. "And these?" His face turned pale. "You shouldn't be looking at those." "My signature is on them." "I never signed them." He took one slow step toward me. "Claire, put the folder down." I didn't move. Another step. "You're making this much worse than it needs to be." I stared at him. My mother's quilt disappears. I find pieces of it in this barn. Then I discover forged documents with my name on them. And you're telling me I'm the one making this worse? Ryan rubbed both hands across his face. For the first time in 14 years, he didn't have a sarcastic comment. He looked exhausted, cornered, almost desperate. Then he whispered something I never expected to hear. "You need to ask your husband." Those 6 words hit harder than anything else he had said, because deep inside, I already knew the answer I was afraid to hear. Ethan hadn't simply stayed silent. He had known far more than he had ever admitted. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The dusty barn felt smaller than it had a minute earlier. Ryan looked toward the doorway again. It was obvious he wanted to leave. I stepped in front of him. "No. You don't get to walk away this time." He let out a long breath. "You don't understand." "Then explain it." "I can't." "You mean you won't?" His shoulders sagged. "It isn't my decision." I looked down at the folder in my hands. My signature was forged. My mother's quilt has been cut apart. And you're telling me someone else makes the decisions? Ryan closed his eyes. "You need to talk to Walter." I laughed. It wasn't because anything was funny. It was because I suddenly understood something that had never made sense before. For years, every important decision in Ethan's family had come from Walter. where holidays were celebrated, who inherited old equipment, which cousin received help buying a house, who borrowed money, who repaid it. Nothing happened without Walter knowing. Nothing. A terrible thought crossed my mind. What was the quilt hiding? Ryan's eyes widened. It was only for a second, but I saw it. The question had landed exactly where it needed to. I took one slow step closer. It wasn't stolen because it was valuable. It was stolen because someone was afraid of it. Ryan looked away. Silence. Another answer. I slowly unfolded the loose blue square I had found. Something felt strange. The fabric was thicker than I remembered. I turned it over. My fingertips brushed against rough stitching along one edge. Different stitching. Newer stitching. Someone had opened the seam, then sewn it closed again, carefully, almost professionally. I pulled gently at one loose thread. Ryan's face changed instantly. "Don't!" His voice cracked. "Claire, don't touch it." My heart began racing again. I slipped a fingernail beneath the thread. With one careful pull, a few stitches came loose. Something white appeared inside the fabric. Paper. Very thin, folded tightly. I looked at Ryan. He looked ready to collapse. I unfolded the tiny packet. Inside was a small handwritten note. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting was instantly familiar. It belonged to my mother. My vision blurred. I hadn't seen her handwriting in years. The note was only a few lines long. "Claire, if you're reading this, then you finally looked inside. People protect money. They protect land even more. Never sign anything without reading every page. The original deed belongs with Margaret. Trust her. Love always, Mom." I read the note twice, then a third time. Margaret. The name sounded familiar. Not a relative, not a neighbor. Then I remembered. Margaret Ellis, my mother's oldest friend, the woman who had been like an aunt during my childhood. I hadn't spoken to her in nearly 10 years. My mother had trusted her completely. Ryan stared at the note. His face lost all color. "You weren't supposed to find that." I folded the paper carefully. "You knew it was there." He didn't answer. "You knew the quilt contained something." Still nothing. "But you didn't know exactly what." Ryan slowly sat down on an overturned bucket. He suddenly looked much older. I thought it was another property document. "What property?" He rubbed both hands over his face. "When your grandfather died," he stopped speaking. I waited. "There were 2 deeds. One was recorded, the other wasn't." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The farmland. Part of it was supposed to pass through your mother's family, but your grandfather changed his mind." "So everyone believed." His words came slowly, as if every sentence hurt. "But he didn't?" Ryan looked down at the dirt floor. "I don't know. Walter always said there wasn't another deed." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to." The barn fell silent again. For years I had assumed Walter owned every acre surrounding the farmhouse. No one had ever questioned it, not publicly. Now I wasn't sure any of it had been true. I carefully placed my mother's note inside my jacket pocket. Then I gathered every folder from the box. Ryan watched me. "What are you doing?" "Taking these." "You can't." "I absolutely can. They don't belong to you." I looked directly at him. "My forged signature is on these papers." "They became my business the moment someone wrote my name." He stood up quickly. "If Walter sees those missing, he should have thought about that before hiding them." Ryan took another step, then stopped. He knew he couldn't physically take the documents away from me, not without proving exactly what I already suspected. Just then, another voice echoed from outside. "Claire?" It was Walter. His footsteps were slow, measured, unhurried, as though he already knew exactly where I was.
Ryan looked terrified. Walter appeared in the doorway. He glanced first at Ryan, then at the folders in my arms. Finally, his eyes settled on the small piece of blue quilt fabric still lying on the workbench. For the first time since I had known him, Walter's calm expression disappeared. It lasted less than a second, but I saw it. Pure fear. Not anger, not surprise. Fear. He looked at me quietly, then he spoke in a voice almost gentle enough to sound kind. Claire, I think we need to have a private conversation. I met his eyes without looking away. No. I think it's time everyone hears the truth. Walter remained standing in the doorway. He looked at the folders in my arms, then he looked at the torn piece of quilt fabric lying on the workbench. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Finally, Walter sighed. I was hoping this day would never come. His voice was calm, almost gentle. Anyone listening from outside would have thought he was comforting me. I knew better. I had heard that tone before. It was the voice he used whenever he wanted to control a conversation without raising it. You've been lying to me for years, I said. Walter slowly shook his head. No. I've been protecting this family. I laughed quietly.
Those are not the same thing. He took another step into the barn. His eyes never left the folders. You don't understand everything that's happened. Then explain it. Walter folded his hands behind his back. Your grandfather made promises he couldn't keep. He divided land that legally should never have been divided. When he died, there was confusion. So I fixed it. You forged my signature. His jaw tightened. I corrected paperwork. You committed fraud. He looked annoyed for the first time. Words like that only create problems. No. They describe crimes. Ryan lowered his head. Walter glanced toward him. You should leave. Ryan didn't move. I said leave. Without saying another word, Ryan walked past us and disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. Now only Walter and I remained inside the barn. The old wooden walls suddenly felt very small. Walter looked tired, older than I had ever seen him. You've always believed I disliked you. I never disliked you. I simply needed someone who understood sacrifice. I stared at him. You expected me to sacrifice everything. My opinions, my voice, my marriage, my inheritance, my mother's memory. And now you're asking me to believe you did it for the family? Walter closed his eyes. When Ethan married you, I knew things would become complicated. Why? Because your mother never stopped asking questions. The words made my stomach turn. My mother knew. Walter nodded slowly. She suspected there was another deed. But she never found it. I reached into my jacket. Slowly, I unfolded my mother's handwritten note. Walter saw it immediately. Every trace of color disappeared from his face. You found that. It wasn't a question. It was resignation. My mother knew Margaret had the original deed. Walter looked away. I searched for years. You never found it. No. I folded the note again. That's why you wanted the quilt. His silence answered me. The note was hidden inside. I thought the deed might be hidden there too. His confession came so quietly that I almost missed it. For 11 years, 11 years after my mother died, he had still been searching through her belongings, waiting, watching, hoping to erase the last piece of evidence. I suddenly understood why Ryan had taken the quilt. He hadn't wanted it. He had been looking for something hidden inside it, something Walter had convinced him existed. The quilt had never been the real target. It had only been the hiding place. I looked around the barn.
So where is it?
Walter frowned. Where is what?
The quilt.
He hesitated, then he answered. I burned it. Everything inside me stopped. The words echoed through the empty barn. I burned it. For several seconds I couldn't breathe. I wanted to believe I had heard him wrong. My mother's hands, every stitch, every memory, gone, destroyed, just because he thought a piece of paper might be hidden inside. Tears filled my eyes, not loud tears, not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that arrive when something precious can never be replaced. Walter's expression softened. I'm sorry about the quilt. But it had to be done. Those words shattered the last piece of respect I had ever held for him. No, it didn't. He looked genuinely confused. If the deed had been inside, it wasn't yours to destroy. It wasn't yours to touch. It wasn't yours to decide. For the first time, Walter had no answer. The silence between us lasted nearly a minute. Then another voice broke it. He's lying. Both of us turned. Ethan stood just inside the doorway. His face was pale. His eyes were red. I didn't know until today, he said quietly, but he's lying. I stared at him. What do you mean? Ethan looked at his father. You told Ryan to hide the quilt. You told him nobody would ever know. Walter's face hardened. Be careful. I'm done being careful. Ethan took another step into the barn. I followed Ryan after Claire came in here. He confessed everything. He never burned the quilt. My heart skipped. What? It's still here. Walter turned sharply toward his son. For the first time, panic replaced his calm expression. Ethan walked toward the old grain bins along the far wall. He pulled away a faded canvas cover. Behind it stood an old wooden trunk covered with dust. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded white bedsheet, lay my mother's quilt, untouched. My knees nearly gave out. I crossed the room without thinking. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. Every square, every stitch, every color. It was all still there. The tiny blue patch had been removed, but the quilt itself had survived. I pressed it against my chest. For the first time since opening the empty cedar chest upstairs, I finally allowed myself to cry. Not because the nightmare was over, because I finally understood exactly how close I had come to losing the last gift my mother ever made for me. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Walter wasn't running. He wasn't shouting. He was quietly walking toward the barn door, toward the family gathering outside, toward the moment when every secret he had protected for years was finally about to become public. Walter stepped out of the barn without another word. For years he had been the man everyone listened to, the man who settled arguments before they began, the man who always appeared calm. Today, for the first time, I saw him walking toward a conversation he could not control. Ethan looked at me carefully. I'm sorry. His voice barely rose above a whisper. I held the quilt against my chest. How much did you know? He lowered his eyes. Not everything. That's not what I asked. A long silence followed. I knew my father believed there was another deed. I knew Ryan had been searching through old boxes, but I never believed they would take the quilt. I searched his face. Were you ever going to tell me? He couldn't answer. That answer was enough. I nodded slowly. I understand. No, Claire. I don't think you do. We carried the folders and the quilt back toward the farmhouse. The closer we came, the quieter the gathering became. People saw our faces before they noticed what we were carrying. Conversations stopped. Coffee cups were lowered. Children sensed something was wrong and drifted toward their parents. Walter stood beside the picnic tables with both hands folded in front of him. Ryan remained several feet behind him. Neither man spoke.
I placed the folders on the long serving table, then I carefully laid my mother's quilt beside them. Gasps spread through the crowd. Walter looked at the quilt. For just a second, relief crossed his face.
He had expected it to be gone forever. Instead, everyone could see it, including the missing blue square. I looked around at every member of the family. I want everyone to hear this. No one interrupted. My mother's quilt disappeared today. It wasn't misplaced. It wasn't borrowed. It was taken. I picked up the torn blue patch. It was cut open because someone believed something had been hidden inside. Several relatives exchanged confused looks. I lifted the folders. While searching for the quilt, I found these. I opened the first file. These documents contain my forged signature. A murmur spread through the crowd. Walter remained perfectly still. His expression revealed nothing. I turned another page. These are property transfers, power of attorney forms, land agreements. I never signed any of them. Ryan closed his eyes. Someone quietly asked, "Is that true?" No one answered. I unfolded my mother's handwritten note. This was sewn inside the quilt.
My mother left it there years before she died. I read every word aloud. When I finished, complete silence settled over the yard. Margaret. The name seemed unfamiliar to most of the family, but not to Walter. His shoulders sank almost imperceptibly. Then my Aunt Helen slowly stood from her chair. I remember Margaret. Every eye turned toward her. She and Claire's mother were inseparable. They trusted each other with everything. Helen looked directly at Walter. You told everyone Margaret had moved overseas. Walter said nothing. Helen frowned. I saw her at the grocery store 2 weeks ago. The crowd shifted uneasily. Walter's face tightened. He had not expected anyone to say that. I reached into my purse. While Ethan and I had walked back from the barn, I had quietly called Margaret. She hadn't answered. But 10 minutes later, she returned my call. I put the phone on speaker. It rang once, then twice. Finally, an older woman's voice answered.
Claire? It's me. There was a brief pause. I found Mom's note. Another silence. Then Margaret spoke softly. So, I suppose it's finally time. Every person around the tables listened. Margaret took a slow breath. Your mother gave me something before she died. Walter closed his eyes. He already knew what was coming. Margaret continued. She told me never to hand it to anyone, unless you ask for it yourself. Tears filled my eyes. I never knew. She wanted to protect you. Margaret's voice trembled. She believed someone would eventually come looking. I looked at Walter. His eyes remained fixed on the ground. What is it? I asked. The original deed. The words rippled through the crowd. It proves ownership of the eastern farmland. It was never transferred. It remained in your mother's name. Several relatives began talking all at once. Ryan looked stunned. He turned toward Walter. You told me the deed never existed. Walter still didn't answer. Ryan shook his head in disbelief. You lied to me too. Walter finally spoke.
I did what I believed was necessary. For who? I asked. The family. No, I shook my head. For yourself. No one defended him. Not a single person. For the first time in decades, Walter stood completely alone. Margaret spoke again through the phone. I've already contacted my attorney. He has the original document. If Claire wants it, he'll deliver it tomorrow morning. I thanked her quietly. When the call ended, no one moved. Walter looked older than he had only an hour earlier. His shoulders had slumped. The confidence that had once filled every room had disappeared. He looked around at his children, his grandchildren, his brothers and sisters. No one met his eyes. The respect he had spent a lifetime building had vanished in a single afternoon. He looked at me one last time. "I never wanted to hurt you," I answered honestly.
You just decided that hurting me was an acceptable price. He lowered his head. There was nothing left to say. Across the yard, I noticed Lily standing beside Noah. She had heard almost everything. She looked frightened. I walked over and knelt beside her. She wrapped both arms around me. Then she gently touched the quilt. "Grandma made it." "Didn't she?" I smiled through my tears. "Yes. And nobody is ever taking it away again." As I held my children close, I realized something I hadn't understood for 14 years. Families aren't defined by the people who demand your silence. They're defined by the people who help you tell the truth. And for the first time in a very long time, I was finally ready to start living that truth. The next morning, I stood outside my attorney's office with my mother's quilt folded carefully across the back seat of my car. The sunrise painted the sky in soft shades of orange. It should have felt like the beginning of a peaceful day. Instead, it felt like the first day of an entirely different life. Margaret arrived a few minutes later. Time had covered her hair with silver, but the warmth in her smile was exactly as I remembered. The moment she saw me, she wrapped me in a long embrace. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I promised your mother I would protect you." "You did," I squeezed her hand. "I just didn't know it until now." She reached into her leather briefcase. Inside was a large sealed envelope. Across the front, my mother's handwriting appeared one final time. "For Claire, only when the time is right." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was the original property deed. There was also a letter. Unlike the small note hidden inside the quilt, this letter was several pages long. I recognized every curve of my mother's handwriting. "Dear Claire, if you're reading this, then life has probably become much harder than I ever wanted it to be. I hope I'm wrong. But if I'm right, I need you to remember something. Kindness is a gift. Silence is not. Never confuse the two." I stopped reading for a moment. Those words alone felt as though she were sitting beside me again. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. "She wrote that during her last month." "I remember." I continued reading. "Your grandfather loved you more than anyone realized. Before he passed away, he changed his will because he believed one day you would need something that belonged only to you. He worried that greed could divide families. He told me that land has a strange way of changing people. If anyone ever pressures you to surrender what is yours just to keep peace, remember this: real peace never asks you to abandon yourself." I folded the letter carefully. For years I had blamed myself. I believed I wasn't patient enough, forgiving enough, understanding enough. Now my own mother's words freed me from that burden. My attorney entered the conference room carrying several legal folders. He carefully examined every document we had recovered from the barn. After nearly an hour, he looked up. "There are multiple forged signatures, several questionable property transfers, and evidence suggesting intentional concealment." He paused. "This is far more serious than a family disagreement." I nodded. "I know." He looked directly at me. "Claire, if you move forward, there will almost certainly be civil litigation. There may also be a criminal investigation." The room became very quiet. Months earlier, I would have hesitated. I would have worried about destroying relationships, about embarrassing Ethan's family, about keeping everyone comfortable. Not anymore. I want the truth. My attorney slowly smiled. "That's exactly where we'll begin." The following weeks were filled with meetings, paperwork, and long conversations I never imagined having. Handwriting experts examined the forged signatures. Property records were compared. County archives produced documents that had not been reviewed in decades. One discovery
led to another. Several transfers had never been properly recorded. Others had been filed using incomplete information. Some forms listed witnesses who later confirmed they had never been present. The investigation continued to grow. Ryan eventually agreed to cooperate. His attorney contacted mine before the first hearing. Ryan admitted that Walter had instructed him to search for the hidden deed. He confessed to taking the quilt. He admitted opening the stitch seam. He also admitted helping store the forged paperwork in the old barn. His testimony changed everything. Walter denied every accusation. At first. But evidence has a way of speaking more clearly than excuses ever can. One document after another contradicted his story. The forged signatures, the altered filing dates, the missing witnesses, the recovered handwritten note. None of it could be explained away. Months later, the court issued its ruling. Every forged transfer involving my signature was declared invalid. Ownership records were corrected. The original deed was recognized. The remaining disputes would be resolved through the estate according to the law. When the judge finished reading the decision, I closed my eyes for just a moment. Not because I felt victorious, because I finally felt free. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered near the entrance. I declined every interview. There was nothing I wanted to celebrate. Justice and revenge are not the same thing. I had never wanted revenge. I had only wanted the truth. Walter left through another exit. He walked slowly beside his attorney without looking toward anyone. I never saw the proud family patriarch again. Ryan approached me before leaving. He looked exhausted, older, ashamed. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I'm sorry. I believed he meant it. Some apologies arrive too late to repair what has been broken. But they still matter. I wished him peace. Nothing more. Nothing less. Then Ethan walked toward me. It was the first time we had been completely alone since the investigation began. He looked as though he hadn't slept in weeks. I've been trying to find the right words, I answered gently. There aren't any. I failed you. Yes. I failed the kids. Yes, he nodded slowly. I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone. I looked at him for a long time. No, you were protecting yourself from making difficult choices. He lowered his head. He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. I'll always be grateful that you helped me find the quilt, I said quietly, but one good decision cannot erase years of silence. He wiped his eyes. I know. We stood there without speaking. Sometimes the end of a marriage doesn't arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives with two people finally telling each other the truth. A few months later, our divorce was finalized peacefully. We agreed to share parenting responsibilities. Lily and Noah continued spending time with both of us. They deserved parents who respected one another. Even if we could no longer remain husband and wife, the first evening in my new home, I unfolded my mother's quilt across the sofa. Sunlight poured through the living room windows. Lily sat beside me, gently running her fingers across the colorful squares. Noah rested his head against my shoulder. It still feels like Grandma is here, he whispered. I smiled. In some ways, she is. I no longer saw the quilt as a reminder of everything I had almost lost. I saw it as proof of everything that survived. Love, truth, courage, and the quiet strength to begin again. If you've stayed with me until the end of my story, thank you. I hope it reminds you that protecting your peace never requires sacrificing your dignity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when the people you love would rather keep it hidden. And if that truth helps someone else find the courage to stand up for themselves, then every painful step that brought me here was worth taking. Before we say goodbye, I'd like to ask you for one small favor. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it.
You never know when a story about courage, truth, and self-respect can give someone the strength to face their own challenges. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas filled with emotional twists and meaningful endings, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Until next time, take care of yourself, cherish the people who truly love you, and remember, real peace should never come at the cost of your dignity.